HaShoah. In Hebrew, this word means destruction, catastrophe, Holocaust. More than 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust, a genocide of unspeakable crimes against humanity that began in the mind of Adolf Hitler and was carried out by the Nazi Party in Germany, and then in all of Europe. The Las Lomas page conducted interviews of Holocaust survivors and their descendants. What started as a small idea to spread awareness and empowerment grew into a truly special and intimate story about our own community. All of those interviewed are here because someone somewhere did the right thing. That person had the courage to say yes. Before the Holocaust, the Jews in Europe lived completely normal lives. Lives just like any other European people. They had no idea what atrocity was about to befall them.
One of the things that I remember vividly is in my early days, very often there would be a knock on the door and I was told to go up to my grandmother's.
The Holocaust began when Hitler targeted political opposition, then those who committed crimes against the Reich. Then they slowly took away the rights of all those considered subhuman, especially the Jews.
Later on, I found out that every time that some of the Nazis knocked on the door, my mother would immediately send me up there. So she and I my Oma and I became good friends. And it is the only one of my family that did not survive.
Beth's Oma, or grandmother, was murdered in a concentration camp called Theresienstadt, a place that acted as a way station to the death camps and as a so-called retirement community for Jewish elderly. At Theresienstadt, people were starved or worked to death. Many died of disease. More than 33,000 people were murdered here by the Nazis.
Let me go on and tell you why those knocks on the door brought my father eventually to Dachau. He was a physician. In those days, the physicians, they weren't necessarily in one category. They took care of the health of people. And there were many times in my very young days that he would allow me to come with him to visit his patients. And that was a wonderful way of bonding with him and understanding some of the things that he did. It was also the warmth that he gave to his patient that eventually saved his life. So when the knock came, some years later, 2 o'clock in the morning, and they took him, he was accused of doing abortions. And in the very early days, especially with Jews, the person was accused of something.
German intellectuals, lawyers, and doctors, like Beth's dad, were the Nazis' first victims, taken away to the camps on trumped-up and false charges.
Something that the Nazis whipped up for them. And he was accused of doing abortions.
Dachau was the first concentration camp, created in 1933 by the Nazis. It was initially created to hold political prisoners. It then grew to include forced labor, and then to imprison Jews.
He was taken to Dachau eventually, and much of this was hidden from me because my mother tried very hard to keep me from understanding and to feel sad about it, which in some ways was appreciated, in other ways the kids told me what was going on, my friends. But the German mind is so that when they accuse somebody of something, it goes on the books.
In the early years, some of these people escaped or were released. Many were not. Beth's dad was one of the lucky ones.
And he was pulled out of Dachau and put into the German jail. And he was there for quite a while. And I remember my mother going to the jail with a basket of food. And I never really understood exactly why. But again, she was not one to try to explain things to me. She was going to too many things of her own to try to make it something that I would really understand. There wasn't a Nazi on the bench. There was an old German judge. And at the risk of their lives, his patients came forward and said, no, nothing like this happened. And the judge dismissed the case, at which point my mother had everything ready for him to get on the train and go to Switzerland, where there were some family members living.
Our team traveled to San Francisco to the JFCS Holocaust Center. This place, along with Adrian Schreck, Director of Educator Development, was where our project had its infancy. There we met with Anne Marie Yellen, a San Francisco resident, friend to Las Lomas High School, and someone who came to speak to the freshman class on April 12th in the Las Lomas Theater. Her first memory of the Holocaust began with Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, November 9th through the 10th in 1938. A time when Jewish businesses were vandalized, when synagogues were set on fire.
Because we lived in the center of town in an apartment building on the third floor, and all of a sudden we heard, if you've ever been someplace where a bunch of glass breaks, it's tremendously noisy. And I asked my parents what was happening as we sat down to dinner, and they said, oh, it's nothing. You have to remember, we didn't have iPhones, there was no internet, so how did we know, And all of a sudden, I looked out the window and I saw flames. What was happening? They were burning the synagogues.
Small acts of courage can have a huge impact. Survivors of these unforgettable events passed their stories and strength onto their families. At Las Lomas, there are many students whose families would not be here today if someone somewhere had not become a force for social change or had done the right thing. What's your name?
My name is Alexander Plashinsky.
Jaden Fisher.
Elena Rich.
Rachel.
David Corinzotto.
Zoe Snorton Phelps.
My great-grandmother.
My great-grandpa.
My grandpa.
My great-grandmother.
My great-grandparents.
My grandmother, Beth Snortum, she lived in Germany as a child. She was Jewish, her family was Jewish. And when she was about 10 or 11 years old, the Holocaust was occurring, and her mother recognized this and was able to get her on a boat from Germany to the United States. So she escaped Germany during the Holocaust.
He told her that what I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot at the floor right next to you and you're going to run. She said, okay. So right as he shoots, she turns, she runs out the back door and just starts running straight into the forest. I don't know, I'm assuming there were fences, but she managed to get into the forest somehow. And she just kept running. She didn't stop. And for about an hour, she just would keep running. And eventually, she ended up stopping out of exhaustion. She just thought to herself, man, my whole family was just killed. Everyone I know, everyone I loved was just dead. I don't know anybody now.
And so then he was taken to a prisoner of war camp. And he spoke a couple languages. He spoke French and German and Czechoslovakian and some others. And so when he got to the prisoner of war camp, he spoke to the German soldiers in German, which made them like him. And so they invited him, this one sergeant he was talking to invited him to come have dinner with them. And he told the sergeant he was Jewish because he wasn't sure how he should respond to being invited to dine with them and almost be friendly with them, since they were attempting genocide of his people. And so he mentioned that he was Jewish, and the sergeant, which he says still surprises him every time he thinks about it, told him to keep it a secret and that no one should find out because he would be sent to a camp and killed. And instead of reporting him, the sergeant then gave him a job working because the sergeant was a staff sergeant and did inventory of guns and arms and stuff. And so then he used my great-grandfather as a translator because he spoke French and German, and then gave him freedoms like taking him into town and outside of the camp, and on a couple occasions he was even able to communicate with his wife, and his wife came to visit him, and they were able to spend a couple nights outside of the camp, just in a hotel that then the sergeant said, you have to be back by this time so no one finds out. And my great-grandfather makes it very clear, he wrote down his entire story, and he makes it very clear that the soldier identified as a German soldier and not a Nazi who had been brainwashed by Hitler's vision, and that he was fighting for his country but not for the Nazi ideals, which was something very important because it could have gone very, very differently if the soldier hadn't been so helpful and so given so much aid to my great-grandfather.
My family had a really rough relationship with the Holocaust. My great-grandmother cooked for the Nazis in the forest, so that's why she lived. And then my grandpa was watching over her in the forest. And my grandpa's two brother and sister, before he was born, they were both killed by Nazis at 14.
Was living in France during the war, and he kind of took charge. He was an only child, and he took charge in trying to escape because he could see that things were getting worse. And so his dad was a stamp dealer, and they worked with they had an Italian friend. His name was Renato Mondolfo, and he helped them sell their stamps really quickly, and they got a lot of money from that, and they were able to buy tickets to go to Morocco, boat tickets to go to Morocco, and they stayed there for a little bit, and then they left to try to go to Ellis Island, but Ellis Island didn't accept them, so they went to Cuba, and then eventually they got into the United States through Cuba.
Rosbadau, Poland, in the early 20th century, but all of their relatives were still in Poland. So my grandfather's cousins and their whole side of the family, basically. And the story that I was told was that my grandfather, when they were in Poland and some were in Germany, and when the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, my grandfather sent messages to them saying, hey, it looks like things are getting bad there. You should come to the United States. And they said, it'll blow over. It's been bad before. And when the Holocaust actually started, all of them were killed. So we have no real idea what happened to all of them. If you look for my mother's maiden name, Gleicher, Gleicher, in the Holocaust, even the DC has the sort of the bank of the archive of names. There's 7 pages of Gleichers. So somewhere in there are my relatives.
May 1st is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. Millions upon millions of lives were lost during this barbaric time, but those numbers are just numbers. Every single one of those millions of people had names, families, and lives.
Well, I mean, I think that the biggest effect that it had was that we just didn't know that side of the family. I come from the Italian side. I have dozens of, I have like 20 cousins, and it's 6 aunts and uncles, and we're very close, and we when we get together for Italian events, everyone's there, and I think the effect that it had was that the Jewish side of my family is tiny. Like we don't have that extended branch. Like it's my ma and her sister, and that's pretty much it. So there wasn't a lot of. I mean, we had a good Jewish community around us in Detroit, and we went to Seder, and we celebrated Hanukkah and stuff like that. But it was never family.
Lasting effect of the Holocaust is that I don't have much family on my dad's side. Also, I have an uncle, and that's it. I have no cousins, because my great-grandparents and my grandma, they had then relatives. They both had siblings and parents who were alive during the Holocaust, who then were also trying to get visas to leave. And they all moved from Austria to Czechoslovakia or to France to try to get to the US. And I think his sister was able to get there, or maybe my great-grandma's brother, I think, was able to get to the US, and that's how they then were able to join that person in New York. But besides that, they all moved and then were deported back, and then he received a couple letters that were pretty desolate, I guess, as they were trying to maintain their hope that they could escape, but it was looking pretty bad. The situation was looking pretty bad, and then he never heard from any of them again. So we still don't know what happened to them, or where they went, or where they were taken. We know they were taken to some camp to then be deported, but we don't know what happened after that. And so then there's no more family I have, and no more connections I have on that side.
One person made a difference. One person said yes.
In 1942, the next year, my great-grandmother, who was the youngest of her family, was notified by this police officer, who was a very good friend of her brother, Leva, who was out somewhere, that they would be basically executing the whole ghetto the next day. And he only could tell one person, and he chose to tell my great-grandmother.
But I kept one of the stars so I could show this is my actual star. And the J in Belgium was Juif for Jew, Jude in German, okay? So that was my story. And we were very scared because we thought, this is just a continuation. But there was a young woman of the age of 18 and 3 or 4 others that were students at the University of Brussels. Their education was social work. And they decided we have to make a difference. You see, there's always righteous people that stand up for a cause.
Through remembrance, the stories of all the victims are not only brought to life, but are a catalyst for change, for acceptance, and for courage.
I'm 16, and it's just hard to believe that someone could have so much courage and in the face of so much desperation.
What I have learned is that even the small acts are incredibly helpful. When I hear somebody saying something to somebody whose feelings are getting hurt, or who is being slandered, what can I do? I can stand by that person. I can say something to the person who is slandering that person. I can make a decision about how can I be helpful to that person.
I think one of the legacies of my grandfather, who was, he lost a number of family members in it, that he was always a big social justice fighter. In Detroit, he fought for black politicians to be elected long before the city was sort of desegregated. So I think there's a legacy, I think, within certainly my family, but I think in a lot of Jewish families that caring about people and caring about social justice and human rights it's part of our tradition, I think. And I think some of that is a legacy of being the people who were persecuted for so long.
The word acceptance. Accept people no matter what their religion is, what their sexuality is, what their political belief is. Accept them. You don't have to agree with it, but acceptance.
How many people are here today because you escaped?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a complicated question too, because I married somebody, and so his family was part of my family. He no longer is with us anymore either. The grandkids that I have 4 grandchildren, 2 of whom, one of whom is graduating here, the next one's coming in next year. And then there are 2 that are married, and one of them has a child, so I have a great-grandchild too. So it's one of those things that spreads itself around. It's just, it's a miracle, and it's wonderful, and I'm very grateful that I was part of it.